All right. Good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. It is Thursday, September 29th, 2022. We're going to meet this morning for about an hour and a half to talk primarily about funding recommendations to the council. Marion just put the agenda in the chat, so the draft agenda, if folks could take a look at that. Roughly our agenda is to review and approve today's agenda and the minutes from our last meeting. Then we're going to spend about an hour talking about fiscal 24 budget priorities and ultimately finalize a recommendation up to the Climate Council. We've got a little bit of unstructured time for anything else this group might want to talk, or if the other conversation kind of bleeds a little bit later. And we've got some time for public comment, and we'll adjourn at 10. So is that agenda acceptable to the subcommittee? All right, seeing some nods and whatnot, so we're good. Okay, so Abby, feel free to kind of jump in here, but if it's easiest, I can just kind of give an overview of this primary conversation. So about a month ago, after we met on September 1st, and we discussed the Climate Council's kind of offer and invitation for subcommittees to send up funding recommendations for the state budget fiscal 24 that will start next July, excuse me. Right now, the state is building a potential budget that starts with the executive branch. The governor's office is building their proposed budget right now. And the goal is to have recommendations of the council inform that process. The governor will deliver that budget to the legislature in mid-January. The legislature will take the bulk of their session to consider that budget recommendation, make their own revisions to it, and then ultimately pass a budget that, if the governor agrees with, will go into effect. If it's vetoed, they'll have to kind of go back and negotiate a compromise. But ideally, we want to get, the Climate Council would like to get their recommendations into the governor's budget so that they're there from the get-go. The council can independently lobby the legislature and advocate for their own budget priorities, regardless of what the governor puts in his proposal. But this is the first kind of shot, the first bite at the apple. So the council wants recommendations from subcommittees. They've directed us, and I can pull up their email shortly that I sent out to you all. They've really directed subcommittees to focus on one-time funding on projects of a discrete nature that usually take 1 or 2 years to spend down, not ongoing operations of state government or new positions. I know this group said that they were interested in looking at both ongoing spending and one-time, notwithstanding the council's request. So we've made that option open to folks, although we suspect the council will only forward kind of one-time recommendations. After that September meeting, we had provided, with Marion's help, a matrix of all the recommendations Ag and Ecos had raised up to the council. We'd given folks a few weeks to review that list and get back to us with their priority recommendations. Several of you did respond to that prompt, and we sent the results of your work back out to the group about a week or so ago. And we have a kind of short list of topics that the respondents have prioritized. As we indicated in that message, one of the respondents did feel that all the priorities that we had identified, all the action items we'd identified in the plan were priorities, and that should be put forward as a suite for funding, and that we shouldn't be limiting what actions move forward in this fiscal year. So a long way of saying we need to come up with something today to forward to the council as far as recommendations go. They do want specific items with specific discrete definitions, and they want dollar amounts. The one thing we don't have right now are dollar amounts, and I don't know that we're going to have, my hope is that with this group, the expertise that you all represent, you will be able to provide some sense of cost and scope associated with these actions, but that's still an unknown in my mind. So I think that's where we're at. And Abby, I don't know if that all sounds good to you or what your thoughts are there. Okay.
Good summary. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions, comments from subcommittee members right now before we kind of get into it? Judy, good morning.
I'm sort of running late. I had a crazy day yesterday. But anyways, I attended a meeting with 3 representatives from CAP and a lot of other groups around the state, including the human rights director from A&R. I think her name is Carla
Ramundi.
Yeah. And I asked them, why are we reducing this? Because they gave us a tool to use to see what's covered, and all the items on that paper were covered under that funding. So why are we reducing it when there's $3 billion coming into the state to cover human rights issues like this?
I don't know what $3 billion you're referring to. Is that from the Inflation Reduction Act?
They said it was from, hang on. I don't know. I have so many notes in here. It wasn't even funny. Okay. That it was a meeting that Keisha called with 3 representatives from CAP. And it was $3 billion that they were talking about.
Okay.
And they gave us links for the tools. They gave us links for, and they told us it's being updated every day and they're adding new things, and everything on that list met the criteria. I'm upset, Billy, that we worked for 2 years to reduce and merge this into a complex and simplified list, and now you want to reduce it to 5. That's kind of like peeing in the ocean. We need them all if we're going to make a difference. We're talking about our future, and we had some really complex discussions to arrive at that list, and we know there's funding for it. So I don't see any, and if we're truly going to take equity into consideration and human rights into consideration, we need to be looking at the entire list.
Great. I think that's a perfectly appropriate recommendation, and if that's the will of the group, we can do that and be done with our conversation today. So I'm agnostic. I'm just trying to facilitate the conversation. I'm just trying to communicate down an interest from the council for action to be prioritized. I don't think there's a sense amongst the council that the state has adequate budgetary resources to fund the full suite of actions in this next fiscal year in the plan, and that's why they want priorities. But if that's not the kind of desire of this group, then we can certainly just say so. So it's up to you all.
So have you been following that funds, and do you understand how much is considered eligible for our work? I
have been, I don't know exactly what fund you're talking about. It may be the Inflation Reduction
Justice 40. It's Justice 40.
Okay. I think Justice 40 is a requirement that certain percentage of federal funds get spent in qualifying ways. I don't know that it's a source of funds. I think it basically directs a range of federal funds to certain qualifying communities.
Well-
Whether that can be all spent on our work, I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Well, I asked the question. And I went through the partial list because they asked for examples. We used it as a guide to go through the tool, and they were all eligible under the tool. And
so based on
race
you know,
is not a race is not an indicator for the application, which is at this time. It may be down the road, but it isn't at this time, which is why, you know, that would make the whole state and all of our suggestions eligible.
Yeah. Great. So with this new information from Judy, what do folks think? Is it our collective desire to elevate all of our recommendations at this time, given the given what Judy just said?
I mean, I think the tricky thing is it sounds or feels to me like maybe this is where I really struggle, because I don't feel like I was away. I wasn't able to be at the council meeting in September. So, and I haven't had a chance to watch it. So, I mean, sure, I'm fine with putting forward all of our recommendations. I quite frankly don't think it will make any difference. That I don't foresee a world where what we're recommending is going to be fully funded, but that doesn't mean we can't, you know, as come to consensus on the importance of them and try to elevate that as being important enough that it needs to be considered. I just don't think, I don't see a world where it's going to happen, but.
Well, we were told it depended on how the money was used, depended on policy and program. And that human rights and environmental justice was the #1 concern with this money.
But does that money exist? Is that the same pool of money to which we're referencing for the climate council's budgetary considerations are coming from? I mean, I think that's what I'm confused about is it sounds to me like maybe what they were referencing is a different pool of money.
They called it
not one that about which I know anything.
Justice 40 Replacement Reduction Act. That's what they called it.
Okay.
Or sometimes they call it J40.
Lauren.
Good morning, everyone. I think that it would be helpful perhaps from this group to kind of whatever we recommend, like maybe it's a 1-page memo that addresses Judy's concern about if there is funding, we should be funding all of the good ideas that we've been working on for almost a year and a half, 2 years. But my personal opinion would be that it would be great if we could elevate a couple that would be like our top priority should we not get as much funding as we would otherwise like to see. I think if in the absence of doing that, it makes the recommendations coming from ours potentially dilute compared to recommendations from other subcommittees. And just knowing how funding works often, it's easier if we identify specific programs and or policies that we would like to see funded instead of just like more broadly, here's our litany of good ideas, fund them at equal value.
Well, that would be fine if some of them really don't cost anything. I mean, think about it. One of our recommendations was to not mow the meridian in between the 2 interstate lanes. So that may be helpful as we discussed, but it wouldn't be elevated as the main priority, but it costs probably little to nothing to do it.
I guess with that, Judy, though, is that a policy recommendation that's going to be an actual budgetary decision then? So if we're talking about our recommendations that we want to include into the budget, that have funding associated to it. Like that's a policy change that actually might save money, but I don't know if that would be a type of decision that would get included in a proposed budget from the governor. So that's just
Well,
more,
that's
that's
what I'm
a,
talking about. Everything should be included because some of them don't even cost money.
My this is a little bit off topic, but I also wanted to say, I wondered about in the memo, the memo that we send up to the council. I think based on the conversations we've had in the subcommittee and a lot of the work that we've done, that I wondered if we also wanted to backstop just transitions recommendations and the actions that they had suggested be moved forward. I believe they do have amounts attached to those, and I think we all agree that that work is really, really important and could at least, I think, help put in place some funding to help with some of the things that Judy is raising, in that there's not equivalent resourcing to certain segments of the work, and that potentially by pushing forward or backing those recommendations, we could actually get that funding in place to try to better position us to have the advocacy power to say, we think that these recommendations are really important. So in our matrix, did that make sense? I haven't had enough coffee.
No, it doesn't. One of the things I've been arguing throughout the last 18 months is, where's the equity in this? I've been saying that over and over and over again. And now we have a chance to fund everything with equity money.
I don't, but I think Billy and I have not heard, I don't know to what you're referring. And so that may very well be true. That's not, those funding dollars aren't something that I'm aware of. And I think they're in a different pool of money than what we're talking about here.
Yeah, but I think don't matter, because I asked them specifics from our list yesterday, and they said, yep, that would be covered. Yep, that fits into the criteria. Yep, that would be covered.
So do you have the names of the people that were at that meeting that have told you that? Can they interface in some way with
Yep, they
the
can.
Climate Council?
They gave me their emails and told us they would communicate with us. A&R had a representative there. Her name was Carla Raimondo. Vermont Law School was there. The South Burlington Rep was there. Center for Whole Community was there. VPIRG was there. The Vermont State Director of Human Rights and Responsibilities was there. CLF was there.
So let me just.
So how come you don't know about this?
Who's the you in that question?
Billy.
I'm aware of this. This is a President Biden initiative to prioritize 40% of all federal spending towards defined communities. It's a relatively new effort. It's not clear how it's going to play out. Many of these executive branch agencies need to promulgate rules and do other things to direct this money, and it's focused on federal dollars only. So I think that's the distinction here. What we're talking about today is how to budget surplus state general fund dollars towards the work of the Climate Council. So while you may be absolutely correct, Judy, that Justice 40 can fund all of our work, and that would be great. I think that's fantastic, and that's a great piece of information. I think what we're talking about today is how to program state dollars to support some priority actions of our subcommittee. So I don't think it's an either or. I think we can still say, hey, here's how we think we should budget limited state surplus dollars in the next fiscal year, and say our hope is that with the Justice 40 initiative, all of our priorities, all of our recommendations can move forward because they appear to be eligible. But I think we're talking about different pots of money, and the state budget is a stacked budget where there's a number of different sources. There's general fund, there's special funds, there's federal dollars, and I think today we're just talking about one of those pots, which is general fund surplus.
Well, and the state fund pots, the state fund will only grow if we request federal funds, correct?
I don't know the answer to that.
come
I know
on, you
there's
do know
some
the
cases
answer,
where
Billy.
we have to, yeah, there's certainly some federal funds where there requires a state match. So the more that we have available to match those funds, the more access to state funds we have.
Well,
Absolutely.
I think before we make a decision to narrow this down, we need to get some answers.
What do others think about that? Jake?
Yeah, answering that question, going back to what Lauren said, and also what Abby shared with the Just Transitions matrix that they created, I do think part of this conversation requires us to have some specific requests that have dollar amounts associated with them, because without that, I think we are diluting the power of our recommendations to get included into the state budgeting process, because that's, yeah, I feel like that dilutes our influence if we don't know the degree to which the resources that need to be allocated. If we're not clear about that, then we're already behind what others are putting forward, who have dollars attached to their requests. I think that's an easier thing for state government to consider. And to the extent that we have recommendations, whether ones that were prioritized and elevated or ones that we want to discuss here, I think that should be a part of the criteria that we consider is do we have an estimate of what the ask is? Because otherwise it doesn't feel like we're quite ready to be putting that forward. And yeah, and I also think that the federal funding conversation, can tie in, but it also is different in ways as well, because the eligibility for some of that funding may not be, may not be state government. It could be other NGO entities that are accessing those funds in different ways. So that's a different pathway for advancing policies outside of the state budgeting process. So
That's true, Jake.
yeah.
So
I
that's
think
why there were so many NGOs there, because they're
Right.
eligible for the funding.
and I think that I think it's good strategy and politics on our side to think about, that the Just 40 effort and maybe create a matrix of our recommendations that we think might fulfill, those programmatic requirements, so that if it's not state budgeting, we have a sense of where else we might be able to accomplish some of the strategies within the climate action plan that fit with those federal funds.
There were a lot of examples people gave about farming and vertical farming and all these different things around agriculture that what clearly fit into what this money could be used for. And so I don't think we should be moving forward till we know more about this. Because how can we say we're going to limit it to 5 things when there's a possibility everything can be covered?
Oh, I mean, on that, the process is going to move. The process is on a timeline that's moving, so we are somewhat constrained by that. Unfortunately, by that reality of this process will move without us if we don't, get something submitted by the time frame that we've been given. So that's just another consideration too.
Well, and as I've said 100 times, we have no word for time. when everything's together, everyone's together and everything's ready, it's time. And so let's get it together and submit it saying we want this J40 money used.
Hey, Alyssa.
Everybody. Turning my video on here. I just wanted to comment on the conversation. I really agree with much of what Judy has expressed in terms of trying to elevate all of our recommendations that we work to and to access these potential federal funds from the J40. I also don't think that we should miss this opportunity that we have now to be part of this other budgeting process and get at least a couple things potentially funded from that. And so I don't think by making a few recommendations for this opportunity right now to the Climate Council that we're saying we only want those things. I think we can say we want all of it and we should be accessing as much funding as possible to move forward with all of our recommendations. And for this small opportunity now, like, let's pick a couple things that we can say this body should act on. Because if we skip that, and I think it'd just be sad to miss this one little opportunity.
We can certainly, you know, if the group is interested and willing, schedule another subcommittee meeting at some point to learn more about Justice 40 and the funding opportunities associated with those and how they relate to our work. So I don't think it's an either or proposition.
I do think too, based on Judy, what you're raising about the Justice 40, that this would be a good moment again to back Just Transitions and their suggestions, to make sure that in this funding opportunity, at least those things that get some of this more direct community engagement work, et cetera, started and funded, that at least that could get that started. And then that might even set us up that much better with the Justice 40 initiative to be able to, once we learn how we can access those funds, you know, it might give us a better window into that. Jake.
Yeah, I just want to, I wholeheartedly second that proposal from Abby to, you know, I think the work of Just Transitions is all of our work in essence. And, you know, they have some really concrete proposals in that matrix that was shared. And I think a lot of the work that we've experienced through this process has really highlighted the lack of resources for that participation and engagement from historically underserved communities. And so I feel like that would be a really strong statement from us, and it doesn't, you know, that doesn't preclude us from also recommending other things that have come out of our committee specifically. So I really like that suggestion. And it gets to some of Judy, I think some of your points too, of like that actually then is asking state government to commit its money, not just federal funds, to you know, equity. And I think coming from multiple committees, that would be a really powerful message.
Judy.
I think legislation has already made that commitment when they said everything we do has to include equity. So you got to put your money where your mouth is. And this is not, like I said, race is not a criteria for this.
David.
I'm not sure how we're planning to move forward, but I have a whole set of questions that relate to, you know, I know a little bit about the complexity of the state budget, and I want to make sure that we're strategic and that the recommendations we put forward are for funds that easily fit within the governor's budget because my sense is that the money will most naturally flow to existing programs, or existing agency, initiatives where there's already kind of a funding line in the budget where we can grow it or add to it. Maybe we can add some language that, directs it, directs the agencies to spend it in a way that focuses on our priorities. And there's also a set of strategy questions that occur to me that, because the legislature ultimately will also have to approve this. So kind of what are the priorities that what are ways to do this that will capture the public imagination, will allow us to organize around it, send clear public messages, and get legislative support for these ideas. So there's a whole set of different levels of complexity I'd love to try to get into if we have time.
Thanks, David. Let's see. So we're about halfway through this conversation. I think we probably need to make a threshold decision about, do we want to proceed with some prioritization of the limited state surplus general fund, acknowledging that there may be and hopefully are significant additional federal funds that can support our work, and kind of recommend both those things, and then move on to focusing on what those prioritized recommendations should be for the state funds? Or do we want to just not do that and move our full suite of action items forward? I think that's kind of, and you all correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that's kind of a threshold decision we need to make before we can move on to David's suggestion. How do folks feel about Abby?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think Judy had her hand up, and then Ryan.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead, Judy.
No worries.
Thank you, Abby. I just want to say one thing. Keisha organized this meeting for all of us to learn about J40, and she is expecting to be named the Economic Development Committee's chair. And so I just wanted to say that for David's comment about the legislation, and she is very supportive of this. And if she gets that position, there will be support there.
Ryan?
Thanks. In service of responding, David, to your comment, I wanted to, rather than action items, elevate two program funding areas that a budget recommendation could add to capacity. I think one of the challenges with one-time funds is there's finite administrative capacity in existing programs to move the funding, and so being conscious of how quickly the money can be spent. Two areas for the agriculture and natural and working land sector that I think could use an additional, or if there was additional funding appropriated to it, that funding would make its way through programs to support farmers to adopt, soil-based and other conservation practices to improve both ag water quality outcomes as well as climate mitigation benefits. And so, looking to the budget that was passed last year, there's some language there, Act 185 of 2022, G600 sub A7, right? The Agency of Agriculture has appropriated $4.76 million of ARPA funding to do that work. That funding is a little bit restrictive as far as how it can be spent. And so these monies, if the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee wanted to continue to focus on ag mitigation, funding with language similar to what was found in the Act would put monies towards Farm Agronomic Practices Program, the Capital Equipment Assistance Program, CREP, all of those good programs that get conservation practices on the ground. To focus on agriculture, but also forestry, kind of resilience, viability, adaptation questions, the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative is another program area at the agency that pulls together a bunch of partners to move funding to farmers for improving on-farm infrastructure over other business processes. That certainly, I think, supports some of the viability questions that this working group was considering last year. And so just to summarize, ag mitigation, following the language from last year's act with these more flexible one-time monies would help plug some gaps without having to add administrative capacity, and the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative for forestry and ag businesses to improve resilience and viability planning on farms would be recommendations I would encourage the group to look at. And also to share, there is an ongoing budgeting process through the Clean Water Fund, where the ag mitigation programs will get the vast majority of their funding, but being as broad as possible to fill in the gaps, specific areas on cover crop and no-till pasture interseeding, type programs or areas where this funding could be spent, and the infrastructure program, the capital equipment assistance program, has long-term implementation benefits as you're purchasing, or the farmer is purchasing the equipment and will use it for multiple years. Thanks.
Ryan, is it your sense that building out the state capacity in this way would allow for, that flex that comes when the federal dollars are so carefully pigeonholed, and this could allow for potentially more equitable distribution of the funds for projects that potentially don't quite as don't meet the pigeonholes, but certainly, from the state perspective or the perspective of the subcommittee, would meet the needs of the work that we're trying to do?
Yes, especially if it is general funding that is appropriated toward this. That's the most flexible dollars, and we can either support. We have a lot of programs that support the existing federal programs through NRCS, and we try to backfill and cover those those things they don't cover. And we can also respond to program areas if there's additional demand for one conservation program or another. So this would definitely help, get money further.
And I know you sent us some recommendations laid out, but I can't remember if they had dollar amounts, or are you willing, did you send that to the full subcommittee?
No, I shared that with you folks. It was a bit late. It was just sharing what was appropriated last year for all of those programs. And it was just kind of blank for the group to make a recommendation. I think $1 million in both ag mitigation and ag, can be moved without additional administrative support, and same with working lands. So those are just two discrete ballpark, but obviously open, it's for the subcommittee to make a recommendation, in my view. But that would be about the capacity we would have with that for their staff.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. I know that we did have some subcommittee members follow the process that we did outline and did do the work to kind of submit some proposals. And I think we do have some agreement amongst those respondents on some of those priorities. So I think if we are going to move ahead with the prioritized list, I think we should certainly, consider and ideally include some of what Ryan suggested, but I don't want to lose track of the work that others have done to move this conversation forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not suggesting this replaces anything. It's rather additive and an example of a discrete funding area that can get to some of the goals. And so, considering some existing programs that may exist to advance those goals on the sheet, if they don't get a specific recommendation. So absolutely, I think we should dig in. I apologize for taking so much time. I just wanted to make sure that the ag mitigation and national working lands resilience and viability was considered by the group. So thank you.
Judy, do you feel like what Lauren put in the chat is, something that you could be comfortable with to make these sort of more siloed or bucketed recommendations for the specific state funding, and then bring somebody in to help us as a group understand better the Justice 40 initiatives and maybe even other federal funding pools from which we could potentially pull to then say, this is how we need to pull in funding to get some more of these actions funded.
I always agree with educating people, and the fact that Billy knew about Justice 40 and as we were working on this, never shared that information, I find disturbing.
That's not fair, Judy. That's not
Well,
fair.
you said it, you knew about it. Did you share it?
I know about as much as everyone else here. It's been a priority of the Biden administration. I haven't gone to any meetings that has been presented on it. It's what I've read in the press. Like, it's just, that's not fair
All
to
right, so
accuse me of
yes,
trying to mislead you. Not fair. I'm sorry.
I didn't say you're trying to mislead. I was upset that you didn't share that information. So all of these other things that she's mentioning here, again, would be educational. And I always agree with that, to educate people.
I think I just want to say that I'm pretty uncomfortable with, I don't think we want to go into throwing accusations around here. I really don't. I don't, and I don't, you know, the funding pools are super confusing. And I think what's confusing is there's all kinds of information that's flying around, right? There's all these federal different programs that have come out from the IRA, ARPA's left over, all these different things. And what's complicated is, as they have to be, unfortunately, you know, we do exist in a system, whether we like it or not, that means that funds have to be allocated in certain ways and go through certain processes to be put out there. And I completely understand and agree with the frustrations that we all feel in bumping up constantly against the parameters that are imposed upon us to do that. But I'm guessing, you know, I don't think that Justice 40 money entered into this because it's not, we're trying to make sure that, as has happened in other instances within the Climate Council, our subcommittee isn't being left behind and pushing forward some of these massively important recommendations to get money to so many of the people that are actually doing this work every day on the ground to ensure resilience and adaptation. And we have, I think, strategically missed opportunities within the council in standing up behind our work and saying, because we can't, we're having a hard time streamlining. And I understand that it's like picking favorite children, and I hate it. It's unfortunately like where we're at. And if we don't pick a few favorite children, I'm afraid that the whole council process is going to go the way that it has gone so far, where it's very technocratically focused, myopically, on carbon emission reductions through electric vehicle implementation and other things like that. And I really think that we have an opportunity here to say, no, some money needs to go to these programs to make sure that some workers and some people are funded to keep doing this work that's really important. It's not just these sort of enormous, huge, overarching climate solutions that are coming from other subcommittees.
Abby, I want to make it perfectly clear. I did not hurl an accusation. I stated a feeling. I felt disappointed that Billy didn't share that information. And he admitted he knew about it. So I just want to make that perfect. Billy, I'm speaking. That's what causes problems when people interrupt like that.
Okay. May I speak briefly? The focus of this exercise is budgeting Vermont State General Fund surplus dollars in fiscal 24. That's the direction that the Climate Council gave us. That is what Abby and I together, not just I, have communicated to this group. That is our task. We can choose to do it or not. There are numbers of other funding sources for climate work out there. Justice 40 is an initiative that supports it. If we want to have a conversation to learn about those things, I'm happy to help set those up. But I was in no way trying to withhold information or mislead anyone. The task at hand was budgeting state dollars based on the memo we got from the council, which we shared with you all. So I'm sorry, Judy, if it seemed like there was a slight or that I withheld information. That was not my intent. I don't believe I did that. And I also don't believe it's my sole responsibility to do that. This is why we have this group. We're a group of experts. We're peers. We're all supposed to bring information to the table. And I don't think any one of us are responsible for doing that. That's why we're a group. So I'm sorry that if that's the way you felt it, it wasn't my intent. I would just hope that we don't, if we feel that way about things going forward, let's just talk about them. But we're not trying to withhold information from anyone here.
So Billy, are you saying that federal funds cannot be a part of state funds?
The monies that we're supposed to budget, my understanding, are from the state general fund, which is largely based on Vermont income taxes and other state taxes that are generated by Vermont. Justice 40, I believe, is a programming of federal funds that come to the state from the federal government. So they're different pots of money. They've got different strings associated with them. They're budgeted in different ways.
But they can be included, correct?
Not in this discussion. We would have to have a separate discussion as to how we would approach the Justice 40 funds as a subcommittee. For today, what we need to try to determine is how we are going to recommend the allocation of the general funds monies be distributed based on our thinking from this subcommittee.
And you don't think that's a little bit of putting the cart before the horse?
I think that if we don't do this, we won't have our opinion reflected in the council's recommendations as to how those monies should be spent. And I think that that would be a truly missed opportunity.
In the absence of us having a facilitator, I just want to acknowledge that Jake, David, and Ryan have had their little Zoom hands raised for a while, and I'd love to make sure that they have time to jump in too.
Yep, let's go in that order, Jake, David, and then Ryan.
Yeah. So I see Alyssa said she supports Ryan's recs, and I wanted to say the same. And it would be helpful to, I don't know, Ryan, if you were able to put those into the chat, and maybe we can document what those are so we can put it to a larger either vote or process of approval. And to kind of connect it with something that Abby, you said in terms of our opportunity here to be talking about not only the mitigation, but resilience and adaptation. I think the recommendation around the working lands piece that Ryan mentioned is really tied to that resilience and adaptation piece. Is, you know, that's the type of investment that helps our farm businesses be more resilient and adaptive economically. And I think that's a really important thing to state and continue to reinforce with policymakers. So that is, you know, a really effective tool that we have, and I think would be a good utilization of funds that's in line with goals around resilience and adaptation. And I really, I appreciate, Abby, you just, you know, making that point, and that we too have the opportunity here to reinforce those elements of the climate action plan, and not just solely focus on the mitigation aspect, which is certainly important. But so and along with that, just as we continue with this conversation, it is helpful, I think, to see maybe some of these proposals in writing, and maybe then we can have a process of like having a voice vote or voice approval, so that we're starting to construct a slate of recommendations that might be beyond what was originally presented to the group.
I agree with that, Jake, and I agree, Lauren, with the way you framed your proposal. So I think we should try to address that and move forward. I do want to I don't want to move past the statement that Judy made. You know, whether it's a expression of disappointment or an accusation. I mean, what I did hear you say, Julie, was that you thought that Billy had intentionally withheld information from the group that was his responsibility to share. And this group can only move forward to the extent that we have trust. And I don't mean that we all agree on the same things, but that we have trust that we're going to treat each other with respect. And at least I feel like there was a lack of respect and acknowledgement of Billy's role and the really valuable role that he's played along with Abby and co-facilitating this group and convening us and helping us have these discussions. So I just want to share that I feel like we, my request to everyone, not just Judy, but to all of us, is that we kind of assume good intentions in this conversation. And if there's specific, interpersonal issues that folks need to resolve, have those discussions outside of the framework of this discussion, because it uses up a lot of time and raises, kind of creates a whole set of emotional tension around a set of issues that I think are fairly straightforward. We can agree or disagree, but we should be able to resolve them without making kind of making it personal. So that's my request of you, Judy, and of the group. Folks don't have to agree, but I would like to proceed forward, and I think we'd be more effective and efficient as a group if we could figure out how to operate in a more respectful way.
Alyssa? Alyssa, go ahead.
Sorry, I was hitting the wrong button there. Thanks, David. That's really helpful. I apologize for not wanting to get into the weeds of the interpersonal dynamic and thinking about like what maybe we could get out of as a recommendation to move out of this meeting as we get closer to the end of our time together to do this work. And I wanted to mention, I just sent a short chat to Abby with a suggestion for what we could potentially do, getting closer to maybe proposing something we could have consensus around. The first is that we, in our recommendation, that frame the importance of funding our complete suite of our group's recommendations put forward to Climate Council in reference to kind of Judy's first day, and make that clear that that's very important to us. Second, that we add these two recommendations Ryan put in the chat with $1 million each attached to them. Third, that we add one education priority that could be a single funded $100,000 for developing climate curriculum. Fourth, that we add some of the natural lands focused priorities that were in that document that was shared earlier at this meeting. We'd need to attach money to that in order to get there. And then fifth, that we add some language around the just transitions recommendations. I'm sorry to moving more towards business, but I feel it's important to me personally that we try to get to some shared consensus around recommendations today.
Thank you, Alyssa. I personally like that idea. I love the addition of the $100,000 for climate curriculum. I think that would be really great to add in there. The thing that I think is still outlying, and maybe Lauren and David, you can help some with this, is some of the and Billy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of the recommendations that came from more of the ecosystem side of the recommendations, or flood mitigation, there weren't dollar amounts attached to those. I don't remember. So that might be something that we have to, determine. It's my impression that they're looking for dollar amounts attached to the recommendations. So similar to how Ryan's laid out the $1 million for each of those ideas, I think it'd be helpful if we had some idea of what to put towards the other recommendations that were put forward.
Yeah, that's helpful. When I sent in my recommendations, I didn't realize, again, having missed the September, basically all of work for quite a while, I wasn't sure
For a good reason.
what level of fidelity we would need to attach, or just like, here are what I think are good ideas to fund. Maybe it's a question for Marion or Bill, somebody who actually was there and present, what the total pot of funding is that we're looking for, so I don't recommend something that seems absurdly low or high. I don't know what that total even rounded is, ballpark.
I don't have it off the top of my head, but I believe it's in that memo that was shared, and I can look it up and put it in the chat.
Thanks.
while Miriam's looking that up, I guess I just want to say that I really appreciate all of you being here. I know this work is complex and I think has really taken a toll over the last few years. And I just feel like I need to say that I truly treasure and I think it's pretty amazing what this group has done. Um, it's been my takeaway or impression that this is one of the first types of conversations that's happened with particularly this combination of trying to talk about agriculture in the context of the natural landscape with ecosystem resilience and things like that. And I really think that we've done some kind of amazing work here. And I hope, I know tensions run high. I know this is very personal. I know for some folks, there's a lot of trauma involved in doing this work. So I just wanted to offer that forward while we're sort of waiting for dollar amounts. The recommendation for equity and the land and the people, I mean, initially and or from this pool of funding, I saw the first step towards that as being to back up just transitions. I think, you know, that group has done some really great work and I feel like it's a good start to get the funding to help people that are not compensated to do this work, but who can ground truth this work, right? That are able to say how this impacts them on a daily basis or how they've been historically impacted by poor decisions and things like that. That seems like a really critical component of moving forward towards a more equitable future for Vermont's citizens is to back up the tangible recommendations that they have put forward. But Judy, if I'd love to hear if you have a different type of a recommendation.
I do. We've had discussion about getting rid of the eugenical language in forestry and parks and recs and A&R and all those places where we don't talk about defective trees or low grade trees. We had a big discussion about that.
Yep. I think that that's a different, I think that's a conversation that has to happen at the agency level and potentially at the legislative level about how they're going to mitigate the harm that's come from the language that has been used unless that has a funding amount to it. I'm not sure it fits into this suite of recommendations we're trying to put forward today, which doesn't mean it's not important or need to be talked about. But again, I'm not sure. There are so many of these things that I don't understand a way that this subcommittee has any power to make that happen aside from putting the recommendation forward again at the council level, but there's no, this is for funding. So is there a funding?
If you don't put funding, if you don't fund that, it's never going to happen.
Okay. Do you have a dollar amount that you think we would need?
Somebody put in 100,000 for education. That education has to happen to all the policymakers. The Social Equity Caucus just created a new documentation for people to follow in how they ask for information and treat witnesses that speak. And I think that's a perfect start to talk about how do we talk about the land? How do we talk about the policies that exist that are written in such horrific ways? And if there's no money to educate people as to what's wrong with it, how do you correct it?
Right. Does the committee members, do we feel like maybe instead of the $100,000 to climate curriculum, do we want to put that towards, recommend that go towards agency resourcing to work on what Judy's referring?
Wasn't equity in the very original bill we were asked to follow? The Global Warming Act, I think it was called. Equity
There were references to equity. Unfortunately, in the way that the law is written, there are no legally binding requirements to adhere to equitable principles. Therefore, it has seemed to me that it is been, that priority has been overtaken in some ways by other priorities that are more legally binding.
which is my point. If we don't put it in there as a recommendation, the land will never be protected.
It just to jump in and share the Just Transitions Subcommittee, their enabling language within the Global Warming Solutions Act uses equity the most times in the bill, and wherein they've provided a framework of funding investment to work on outreach and education, perhaps more broadly than an agriculture and ecosystems subcommittee, but looking at those funding recommendations they've made, like the $1 million that's in there, is a pretty comprehensive proposal that I think makes a recommendation that fits most closely to the charge of equity considerations. And also that was what that group was charged to consider and part of their role from my reading of the bill.
Yeah, I can just add that I can put it again in the chat. The recommendations Just Transition made, they did a really fantastic job. Not a memo, but they laid out what their requests were, what the outcomes would be, and what the funding amounts would be. And I linked in the chat, but could do it again. And I will say other subcommittees are thinking of referencing their recommendations in their own to sort of give more weight to those. So that's something you all could consider doing.
That would be, thanks, Aaron. I was looking for that. I'll just have a PDF. I don't have a URL I can share. I think we discussed that as part of this group. I think referencing those recommendations and supporting them would also be valuable for the group to consider.
Let's see. So Marion, you said that the bucket of money we're talking about is 244 million, huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's for all the
Blown
states.
way, we've blown way past that already. Whatever, I don't care. It's important. So yeah, Judy, my thinking at least about backing Just Transitions is that puts that much more, the more people that can come together behind and maybe Marion, if you, oh yeah, there they are. So Marion linked to that memo again. It's laid out, I think, really well. And I know that they've done a lot of work on this. And I feel like it's a really powerful statement for us to but for us to stand behind their recommendations to say that this is a really high priority for us, that this funding in the ways that you have laid out to ensure equity moving forward, that's a really high priority for us. And let's see. Lauren's putting dollar amounts in the chat. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not. Let's see. Do subcommittee members think it would be helpful to have a collated list with funding designation amounts sent out to look at as a whole document to try to determine whether that's what we take forward, or are you guys able to sort of funnel that through based on what's coming forward in the chat?
Alyssa had a pretty good collated list. If the group's in agreement with adding mine, you could just drop those on there, which I think also included Ryan's.
Yeah.
And then anything that, and I think you dropped in a couple of lists while I was doing chat for.
Yeah, and maybe I could make a suggestion, Abby. I don't want to assume that facilitation role, but I wonder
Oh, please, that's fine.
if we couldn't really just have a quick, speed dating kind of conversation where we walk through each one of those recommendations that are in the chat. I have trouble both reading and digesting the kind of visual and auditory conversation. So if we could connect the dots, and maybe if folks are willing, maybe Alyssa could kind of describe her recommendations, and then Lauren could kind of walk through hers, and then we could, others may have other suggestions, and then we could start to prioritize those as a group now, rather than kind of have an iterated discussion where we have to send stuff out in writing and respond to it. And then before we ultimately submit something as a subcommittee or recommend it, yeah, I think it would make sense to see it all in writing so we can all chew on it. But for the purposes of our time today, it seems like some folks have done some good homework in advance of this, and it would be great to benefit from hearing their thoughts.
That's fine. Abby or Billy, does that sound like what you want to do? You want me to read the list that I had and then one by one and have us discuss, and then Lauren can do the detailed discussion of the 3 that she put in there. It's just 3 that you put in there, right?
Is it, Alyssa, is it possible to share those in a one Word doc? And then that way, to David's point, like we're all looking at the same thing in total.
Absolutely. Yeah, I put them actually, I just started making notes at the top of the document that was shared before the meeting. And so if I can add that to the chat, I will. Otherwise, I'll just send it in an email, but that's great. The first thing on there was an introduction that really frames the importance of funding the complete suite of group recommendations and putting emphasis on the just transitions work. So maybe we could just start with any kind of conversation around that while I try to get the document to everyone.
Okay, well, I assume that, Billy, is this something that you and I would probably frame out the memo and then send it out after we've sort of discussed what is going into it? If so, I think to Judy's point, what's really important that comes through in the framing, our initial framing, is, a substantive narrative push behind the incredible importance of funding resilience and adaptation measures in equal amounts to, or not even equal, that they are just as important as mitigation measures and need to be taken into consideration just as seriously. And I think, any ways that we can, make sure that that's framed within that first section is really important, because Judy's correct. There isn't a thing we've talked about that isn't really important, and all of it feels very, watching footage of Ian rolling into Florida only drives home the importance of the investments behind the resilience and adaptation capabilities of our communities.
Yeah, I think that sounds fun.
Well, just while Alyssa's putting her document together, can I ask a quick clarifying question, Marion? The amount that you suggested is that is available in surplus for, is that specifically like the administration is looking to target that funding towards that amount of funding towards climate related, or that's just the total surplus? So we don't
Yeah, that's just the total surplus. I don't think there's been an amount articulated to target towards climate funding. So that's the total surplus. I think also it's why it wasn't called out in the memo is we don't want you to focus on that too much because it's total surplus that other agencies and folks will be pulling from.
Yeah, because that's helpful, because I was thinking, I mean, I know like we're in a total housing crisis and there's a whole set of, of issues around opiates and social justice and schools. And so I imagine there'll be a lot of competition for those funds.
Yeah, I think worth keeping it in mind, but also formatting your recommendations with what's needed for the funding without thinking too much of that 244 million. And then that's a reference for both the administration and the legislature to understand what those investments are needed.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
It's also important to recall also that the ARPA spending network climate action investments have a multi-year implementation timeframe. And so the one-time monies are also challenging for some of the programs to be stood up.
All right, it should be in your inbox now, folks. Does anyone see it yet? I just replied to Billy's last email to the group. Okay, I assume from the silence that you're all looking at it. So there's kind of three sections with some lines. The first section is some of the detailed notes about the recommendations that were put in the chat. The second section is like the short version, which just has kind of topics and dollar amounts. And then the last part is actually, it's just the stuff that was in the document that was sent to us before the meeting. So that last part is things you should already read and might not be most relevant to the conversation we should have in the next 15 minutes.
I just want to express admiration, Alyssa, for the fact you pulled that together in the course of 3 minutes.
I have helped, maybe, who knows? Also, Ryan sent me that short list in the chat and I just popped it in. So thanks to him too.
Maybe once everybody's done scanning, I'll frame it this way. Is there anyone who doesn't feel comfortable moving forward with this recommendation slate?
I have a question.
Yes.
How are we defining ag and forestry resilience.
I think based on how, well, Ryan, do you want to go? Or I was going to say, I think based on how Ryan framed it, he was taught that $1 million for ag and forestry resilience would go into the working lands. The recommendation would be that it goes into the working lands enterprise fund pool. Is that, am I remembering that right? Or that's the potential for it.
Right, yeah, I guess that summary list could be updated for ag mitigation programs at BASM through water quality title. Ag and forestry resilience is investments in the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative, WLEI. So spelling those out, both of those were included in the initial climate action plan and our existing funding areas.
So I don't think we'd necessarily, Judy, be putting it forward with a specific definition as to how we're funding those resilience, but it would be based within the matrix that we already have. And the idea is that if they could give more funds to that pool of money, it would add flexibility to the funds so that there was more, it was a little bit more malleable to meet the needs of the folks on the ground.
So are we saying we want to give them $1 million to cut down more trees? Or are we saying we want to give them $1 million to leave forest as forest?
I don't
think either of those.
I don't think either of those necessarily. I think this would go into a pool. I guess I'm not really sure, but it
Well,
wouldn't.
I think we need to be clear because that's one of the debates that's happening in the biomass sector.
Okay. David or Jake, and then we'll circle back around to if somebody has more specific thoughts about Judy's question.
Well, just to build on Judy's point, I do think it might be worth spelling out the ag and forestry resilience line there. It may be assumed by everyone, but just to say it out loud, I think that should be a little more specific to saying, that there has, as the one above talks about for implementation of climate change mitigation practices, that might also include, climate adaptation practices as well. But similarly for ag, forestry, and resilience, some reference to the importance of tying that to climate mitigation and adaptation. I don't know that this group is going to resolve the question that Judy has raised about can it be a forest if you cut down the trees and let them grow back or not? I know that's a discussion that's happening, but it seems pretty clear to me that the goal of the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative and the idea of having some additional funding tied to climate change would be beneficial because it would be trying to keep those lands in some kind of open space, whether it's managed or not, but it would have more carbon in it if it actually was producing, if it was, economically valuable land. And I think that's the goal of that whole program. Anyway, but my main point was really back to just kind of having some language in there about the tying it to climate adaptation mitigation.
Actually, David, we've been learning from presenters that it's best not to do all that.
Well, Jake, go ahead.
If there's a response to that, I can wait, but so on this theme of the working lands recommendation, some additional context is that there will likely be a push to get $3 to $5 million from the Working Lands Coalition, plus some other groups that are going to be advocating for that. So I think we should be, maybe clear in our language about is this, so this is 1 million of additional funding above base. And to David and I think Judy's point is this 1 million that we want to try to tag specifically to resilience and adaptive related projects, or there's some criteria, you know, that the Working Lands Board will have to determine kind of that fits within that the million that we're recommending. So I think we need to be clear about saying that this is a recommendation for $1 million above base, and that, you know, are we trying to distinguish this $1 million for specific projects that relate to adaptation and resilience?
I think those are great comments. Jake definitely would support inserting the language $1 million, you know, above. I don't know if there's base funding, but other considerations would be additional monies. And as far as tying specific restrictions to it, what I was putting forward, or earmark them for climate practices, I wasn't suggesting that. I was suggesting that the additional monies in that program supports ag and forest businesses to be able to continue to be in business or improve their business and continue to steward the land. And I wasn't proposing additional narrowing of funding or specific practices. I was going to leave it to the board to decide how to appropriate that. So that would just be my responses. Thanks.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I guess the thing that I'll say is I think it's interesting that we talk about how critical some of this resilience work is too, but the reality is that our businesses that help to, at least, I don't know, my business, which some of you have indicated you believe in, is one medical emergency away from selling our herd. That is not an uncommon thing across our state right now. So if folks like me can't stay in business, that's I don't think that's great for resilience and adaptation for our state.
So in light of that, I would suggest that we increase the amount of money we're asking for, to be in line with what I think other entities are going to be requesting, and that is more in the range of $3 to $5 million of, you know, one time. And I got a thumbs up from David. So
Lauren?
I was just looking at the time, and it seems like we all are nodding to each other's recommendations, that list of 7. So I'm hoping we can say that we're in agreement there with the addition, with the edit that Jake just mentioned, bumping up one of those pots of funding. And I'd just like to avail myself to Abby and Billy to help craft that memo to the full council if you need the help, but just want to make sure that we can all just thumbs up the 7 recommendations that we've discussed today and then move to public comment.
I always want to avail myself of your help, Lauren, for the record. Billy gives a thumbs up. Do we have thumbs up to move forward with the 7 recommendations? Jake? Judy?
No.
Okay. I don't.
Can I ask a question of Judy? Judy, would you be willing to also help with the memo if it's for identifying these 7 are specific to that state surplus pot, but that the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee has a full suite of recommendations that should be considered for funding for all of the other federal opportunities that become available to the state in the coming years?
Yes.
Okay. I think, yes. Does that mean Judy's going to help? Judy, you're willing to help craft it so that it can?
Well, I'm not in agreement with the verbiage in these, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Yeah. I mean, we've had quite a lengthy conversation about language, and yet you put working lands enterprise, working lands in there. All land is working. They all have different jobs, and it's not just ag and forestry.
I think I completely agree. You and I have talked about this a number of times. I think this is again one of those impossible situations where, yes, our subcommittee has done a lot of work on this, and I think all understand the need to adjust and shift language. What's really difficult is we're talking about programs over which we have no control for what they're named, and that the Working Lands Enterprise Board is in, I think it's even in statute at this point, named that way, which isn't something that we can change at this juncture. And then it gets really complicated to try to talk about where to send funding if we are not referring to the programs as they're currently understood within the bodies that within the legislature, within the administration, et cetera. So I think there's just I don't know how that transition happens or who facilitates it or who has control over it. I completely take your point. I don't know.
So am
How
I
to change
missing it?
that
Where in
today.
here is what we just talked about with addressing funding to cover the language use in other areas? We just talked about that. Where is that in here? Am I missing it?
I don't know.
But do you see what I'm saying? Sometimes I feel like I talk for just putting words out into the air. I
No,
say things, nobody listens, and I find it extremely frustrating.
I know that you do. It's not that we're not listening. It's that they're
Well, we just talked about it. We just talked about putting money in there to address language that was inappropriate in policies and regulations in different agencies.
But then we also talked about supporting Just Transitions recommendations, which I believe we then went over that they do have a reference in their memo to.
Yeah, we've heard that. We've heard that before. And then as they narrow and they move things out. And I believe a recommendation from us, like somebody else said, will help support other groups.
Lauren?
I'm just going to jump in quickly to say, I think, Judy, I was admittedly half listening because I was trying to type to respond to Cheryl, but I think I heard you while you were talking saying there's a lot of reference to working lands, which is what Cheryl was also saying. I just want to comment that of the 7, I could make the strong case that 3 of those 7 in particular, the ones that I recommended and others here have supported, are very expressly for natural systems protection and not just working lands. And I think we have to identify and support both of those 2 separate, but also not so separate entities across the state. And I think our recommended budget proposal here does that well.
And I understand that and appreciate it, Lauren. My question is about the language in general, because it's popping up everywhere all the time. It's not just working lands, it's defective and low-grade trees, and all of that language comes from a period of time from eugenics. And it needs to be reconsidered. It's outdated. And if Just Transition wants to take it on, fine. But I think we should support that.
Would you be comfortable if we add a very specific recommendation to our list, like a number 8, that specifically addresses that concern around language? I mean, we could suggest that some money go towards a commission and a report or research. I mean, maybe that's what we need to do now. And that would help
We've
us.
all come to the agreement in various conversations. It's problematic, but we don't have it anywhere.
yeah, should we add one right now? I mean, would everyone be okay with that? I put a suggestion of how we could add it, like $50,000 for this commission and report. And that would highlight it. Does anyone else, I mean, Judy, is that the kind of thing you'd like to see?
Where did you put it?
Oh, I put it in the chat. It says
Okay.
10:01. Or
Yeah.
any modification to
Well,
that
it's
you
not
would.
just, well, I don't know. It's like forestry under A&R and Parks and Rec under A&R.
We could just say state of Vermont rather than A&R.
Because it's
And that
a
would make
lot
it
of
broad.
agencies.
Okay, so we could just do state of Vermont agencies.
Well, I'm not okay with referencing eugenics. I don't agree, and I
Okay.
hope no one's heard me to agree that the use of the term working lands somehow suggests a a connection to eugenicism. I don't agree with that, and so I mean I'm totally fine with having setting aside money to encourage to have state officials work to examine the kind of language you use to talk about our lands, because I do think there is, I mean, the part of what Judy suggested I agree with is the fact that we do often talk about nature as a commodity that just exists for our use, and that's led to some serious disconnections and problems in the way that we live on the land, and we really want to transform that. So I think talking about language is a good idea. I just don't agree with the assertion that the idea of human racial selection is represented in language like working lands. That's deeply racist,
Well, that's the
language.
pro-
That's I'm sorry, I wasn't quite done.
Thank
But
you.
I mean, that's kind of a suggestion that by using the words working lands or talking about the kind of different grades of lumber and trees, that somehow there's racist intention in that, and that seems pretty far-fetched to me. I'd rather have it be a recommendation that just talks about, we should talk about language that reflects the broader values of the landscape that we live on and doesn't reduce it to just a commodity. But I couldn't agree to using the reference to eugenics in this.
I'm sorry, David, that you missed all some of the conversation we had on this. But the early conservationists who started conservation based it all on eugenics. Eugenics is not just people. It's animals, plants, fish, everything. And so the language that's being used, I mean, I just was reading something about people complaining about John Muir's language being eugenical. Madison Grant, all of those people, Madison Grant started the Save the Redwoods. And why did he start it? Because he related redwoods to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and they needed to be saved to be the strong people in the country. It's all over in the literature. I'm sorry you feel that way, because it's as clear, it clearly represents fish, birds, animals, trees, plants, everything. I can send you some links to presentations if you want. I'm on an anti-eugenics international committee, and they present all the time on that.
I'm concerned that we're not going to get consensus around how this recommendation could be added. It looks like potentially we could have a placeholder in there, and then maybe Judy and David and others could input on where we have consensus around how that recommendation could look. I hope that we could agree that that should be included in some way before we close our meeting today, unless Judy, you would not want any of this to go forward unless we have more agreement on that.
I'm willing to have a sidebar with people, because it's not just that.
Admittedly, this is where I start to struggle with how our process works at this point.
Well, we don't have consensus.
Correct.
In the absence of consensus, do we have a way to move forward?
I don't know.
I believe the council has a decision-making rubric that does enable voting if consensus isn't reached and the opportunity for a minority opinion, but I'm not certain about that, but that's my recollection.
Yeah, that's correct, Billy, for both the council and subcommittees.
It seems
And
like discrepancy is really around the use of the word eugenics in this small recommendation that we would add. Is that right? Like, David, would you abstain from voting or vote against if it had the word eugenics in the recommendation for the report?
Well, I mean, the language that you provide is kind of general. So, I mean, I'm fine if folks want to take another run at this, but just, you know, with my concern in mind, because I know there's going to be some drafting work. Well, my concern is the equation of the human eugenics movement with actual words like working lands and the grade, you know, different grades of lumber. I don't disagree. I share Judy's understanding of the history that there's a very close tie to the early conservation movement in the US and eugenicists. You know, whether it's Muir or Teddy Roosevelt, for that matter, we're very much connected to that. What I'm disagreeing with is the idea that the language in the statutes that use words like Working Lands Enterprise Fund are a reflection of a eugenics movement. And I think we can encourage the state to, you know, to spend some money and take some time to examine the way that the kind of language that we use in our statutes and programs to make sure that we are talking about these resources in a way that is respectful. But it seems to me too conclusory to suggest that we've concluded that there is the use of language that reflects eugenics by the use of words like working lands, which is what I've understood Judy to be saying.
I'm not saying in the name of an organization or institution if they use the word working lands. I'm not saying we should be fixing that, but I am saying we should be fixing, educating, helping people to understand how offensive these words are, because it hasn't changed. It's still with us today. They're still harvesting trees that are considered defective and low grade for biomass. When you ask them to define that, they're telling you, oh, one tree fell down against another and made a scrape, and so it doesn't have a high economic value. That's what they're telling us. That's eugenics. Because when you look at what that tree offers as far as sequestering carbon, it's useful. It's beneficial.
I think our goal is not to have that argument between Judy and David right now, but to say whether or not we should invest time and make recommendations to have that conversation in a very thoughtful and specific way where there's lots of time for it. Lauren has her hand up.
Yeah.
I was going to make the same recommendation and just acknowledge regarding consensus. We do have consensus around creating a memo, Lauren, me, Abby, Judy, and Billy, to the full council by the October 7th deadline, discreetly acknowledging those 7 that we've agreed on, while also recommending that the council consider accessing those bigger federal pots as they become available. I think we've all agreed to that. So we should say,
No,
yes, Judy.
I have not agreed to the 7. That's what I've been telling you.
Right, but I asked if you would be okay working on the memo that said for the state surplus funding, we say these 7. And we also say that we have a full list that should be funded. And since we know there's going to be a windfall of federal funding from a whole bunch of different sources, we should be looking at elevating those recommendations through those as they become available to the state.
And I agreed to work on the list, yes.
would you agree to working on the memo, which is what I think how I phrased it
The
before
memo,
was,
the memo, but yes, the
Yeah.
list is 7 as well. I don't agree with the way the 7 are written. If you want to define that in the memo, fine.
okay. Maybe that's something that we can work out while we work on the memo then as a foursome, but we're already 13 minutes over and we haven't had public comment and I have a baby to feed. So I gotta trying to move this along in a way that gets everyone on board.
I know, I don't know how to resolve this. We hear so much critique about that we don't leave time and space for public comment. I know people have other meetings they have to get to, so I think for the moment, we have to agree that the 4 of us will work on the memo and see if
I think that we can also just fall back to the whatever it's called, the charter that the full council developed both for the council and subcommittees for decision making. And hope that anything that we can potentially add will garner greater consensus in between meetings, but at this current phase, right now in public on the record, that we need to come to a vote on the 7 and the recommendation that the 4 of us work on a memo that addresses alternative pots of funding in the future. I don't think we make motions, but we should. And so I make that motion.
That's not consensus.
Right, which is why the council came up with the decision-making framework, Judy, that says if you can't come to full consensus, then you have to fall back on a vote.
Oh, let's say you're asking, yeah, I just posted the decision-making protocol in
Can
the
you just
chat.
read it?
Was
Just tell us.
going-
Can you just tell us so that we don't all have to read it right now?
It says if the council cannot reach consensus on specific issues despite its best efforts, the council will use the majority voting protocol described in the GWSA.
And that's true for subcommittees as well.
Yes.
I vote to advance a memo that addresses those 7, potentially 8, if we can come to agreement on the 50K recommendation that Alyssa's posed based on the conversation between David and Judy. While the memo will also reference additional federal funds and the need to advance all recommendations from agriculture and ecosystems as more money becomes available to the state.
I have to do that. Do we have quorum? I think,
Yeah, you do.
okay.
We have 7.
Okay, so all in favor of Lauren's recommendation, please indicate so by saying aye or giving a thumbs up.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. So the minutes need to reflect that we had 1 no vote and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Let me just write this down real quick so we have a record. Sorry.
1 no vote and I believe 6 yes votes.
I
Thank
think
you.
I saw everyone but Ryan, but maybe Ryan did it.
I think Ryan indicated he had to switch over to another meeting. I'm guessing
Okay.
he might be listening, or has it on his other screen or something, but so,
Okay, I have it.
okay, so should we move to public comment now? Okay, all right, so let's open the floor up to public comment.
Well, I just think that everyone's not here and the public comment isn't going to be listened to or paid attention to. I tried to comment in the chat. My only comment right now is that going forward, you hold public comment at the time it's supposed to be held in the agenda and then continue your conversation later. I put comment aside from that, and I think that's very important. What do you all think about that?
Yeah, I completely can hear and understand your frustration, Cheryl. I do think that we need to be better as a group at keeping it to the time. I also just want to acknowledge that as decisions have to be made, we do need to keep quorum. And if we go over making sure that we have quorum to make those decisions is, I think it's critically important to making sure that ag and ecosystem voice is heard whatsoever in the full council process.
So I have another question for you. What do you think that public comment is for? I kind of always was under the impression that public comment was things to hear from the public to be able to help you to inform your decisions and to be able to, rather than just having people just, I don't know, talk or vent or whatever. It was supposed to be for you all to be using what public says in your ideas, in your decisions, in your discussion, etc. So is that what you think that public comment is for? Or do you think it's just for the public to just be able to, I don't know, talk and not use it? That's a question for anybody to answer, for us to converse about.
I think that's a fair. Oh, go ahead, Alyssa.
No, I was going to say, I think I agree. Like, we would ideally have your input earlier in the conversation so that we could include it. And I think what I felt and witnessed today was that we were in the middle of a challenging and important conversation around consensus. And I think everyone just wanted to get through that and kept thinking maybe we'd finish it earlier than we did. And so it's unfortunate the way that it played out, but I think the urgency of like at least trying to get a recommendation to the budget process was like top of mind for everyone. And I'm sorry that we didn't make time for public comment earlier, because I think it's really important that you have opportunity to comment and that we can hear that while we're making decisions.
So there were several times. Did you want to say something also, Abby, before I say something else about what Alyssa said?
Sure. I think that this has been one of the most open processes I have ever been a part of. I think I'm starting to feel really frustrated by the fact that it feels like we can't have a conversation as a subcommittee, which was duly appointed to do this work. And I think that the public has had far more involvement in this process than I've ever seen in any other process. I personally have been involved in so many processes where the public has literally no say, even when there is theoretically public comment. And I'm sure that this is really frustrating. I also feel like sometimes I don't feel like the members of the public are completely cognizant of what this process has asked of those of us who are here on the subcommittee and all of the things that we are trying to navigate and do. And it's starting to feel borderline problematic and slightly offensive sometimes, how these discussions sometimes come across, and the assumption that we're somehow, I don't know. I'm quite frustrated at this point by the way that some of these things are being handled, and that's my response.
So I had a couple of earlier, not at the end here. I had a couple of suggestions or ideas that could have been, I thought, pretty useful, like putting things into quotation marks in your recommendations and that kind of thing, and that would have potentially, helped and solved some of the problem that you were going through. I did put a couple things. I against the rules put comments in chat, I guess. So.
Well, I'll say as a person who struggles with ADHD that it's extremely difficult to facilitate a meeting while there is chats coming in. And it's really difficult for me to try to keep a train of thought and try to consciously register the comments in the side of the chat and manage being extraordinarily careful about how I'm using my words and my language so as to not frame things poorly or come across poorly. And so this sets up I have struggled this entire process with, I apologize, I cannot keep track of the things that you're saying and register them in a way that I can then formatively say registers in the things that I'm saying. It's different people process information differently. And so, I think some attention needs to be given for that as well.
No, I totally agree with you, Abby. I feel the same way about chat. I just put stuff in there because that's my only option when I'm trying to contribute something that I think might be useful. And I do think that I have things that are useful, and I think that others do too, that you guys could use actually. I think anyway, that's it. That's all I have to say. But I do hope that you will look at the things that I have. I think that it's important that I think I put some ideas for recommendations in the chat as well. So maybe if you hit save chat, you can take a look at them and see if you can work any of that in. I don't know how much money to ask for these various things, but I do think that you should put quotation marks around things like working lands and low grade. At least put quotation marks around things that are terms that are questionable and that need to be changed. And that way you can, at least your own selves in your own recommendations, you can not do the things that you think need to be changed. Additionally, I think that money should be put in straightforward in that all the stuff that Lauren had to say, but I think add in money to actually purchase easements and towards easement, permanent conservation easements, and for natural lands, not working lands, not ag or lands that are going to be logged or forested. But you can read and I'm happy to talk more about this. It would be, I would like to, I think it would be useful for us all to have some of this information be part of conversation, not just like me quickly spouting out something and then not being able to have conversation about it, because you probably want clarifying information, etc. And a lot of this, by the way, I also wanted to tell you is that a lot of the frustration that I see between some people, for example, Billy and Judy, I have been attending the biomass task group meetings as well. And I think a lot of the frustrations and the mistrust or distrust is stemming from a lot of behavior and actions that have been going on in that and in those meetings through the summer. There have been various things that have been going on that I think are the basis for maybe people acting frustrated or whatever it is that they're acting, So having seen that stuff, and I encourage you all to watch the biomass task group meetings and recordings, because that has a lot of information. Some of your recommendations, which came from not consensus, but voting, that were dismissed and put on hold by the VCC, are still in question. There's a lot of information that you probably would want to see from some of that stuff. Yes, that's it for now. For what it matters, because most people are not here, and I don't know that they really, I don't know. So that's it. Okay. I really highly suggest you just allow public comment to occur, and then go back to your conversation.
Thank you, Cheryl. I've noted that and the quotation mark suggestions around working lands and other terminology that is problematic. We'll try to make sure that our memo reflects that. Are there any other public comments at this time? Okay, seeing none, I think we'll close this meeting down for the morning, and I hope that everybody has a successful remainder of their day and enjoys the sunshine.
Thanks,
Thank
Abby.
you.
Thanks, everyone.